International University. Thank you for inviting me over here, and I'm glad to see so many bright faces, such a wonderful audience over here. So, briefly about myself first before we start. As you probably can judge from my tie, I'm somehow connected to the regional economics. I got my PhD at the University of Kentucky on agglomeration economies. For a living, I run regression analysis with firm-level data and also teach students. And today we are going to talk about the city, what the city is, and how the economists see the city, how the economists think about the city, how to make the city more prosperous than it is, why cities fail, and about such things. Can you hear me without the mic? I usually walk around, so I think I'm not going to use the microphone. So without any further ado, let's probably start. Very simple question up start. How many economists do we have up here in this room? 1, 2, 3, enough. So what is economics? What are the major questions that economists answer? It's just a short quiz, so let's try to recall that. So what do economists study? What is the object of their studies? What is the subject of the economics?
Limited resources and unlimited needs of people.
Very good. So we have to choose between limited resources and limited needs. We study questions: what to produce, what to consume, how to produce, how to consume, for whom. Actually, the question for whom is more or less wide, but also these are the questions that we are thinking of. Within this framework, we are going to look at the city as well. What we are dealing with people, we are dealing with firms. We do not deal with money, we are talking about choices, because again, as you said, we have very scarce resources and we have to choose between different resources. That means we always have to choose between different opportunities. Once we're choosing between different opportunities, this basically means that some people will get more, some people will get less. As very mean scientists, I usually say that economists usually decide who is going to suffer first, who is going to suffer last. And this is equally right for economics of the city, for economics of the firm, for economics of consumption anywhere. What we basically use, we look at the mathematical models, we're looking at the thought experiment. This is, in some sense, economics is similar to physics and meteorology. That means we can explain what is going on, but we cannot predict. Basically, if you're unemployed, the economist can explain you why you're unemployed, not how to get a job. This is for business people. So we are in economics, we explain this, and we usually get to this analysis with looking at some data, all different types of data, human behavior from human questionnaires, firm behavior from all different statistical data, administrative data from just to see how the city actually lives, and this is kind of the framework that we live in. So once we have to choose all the time, again, because the resources are very scarce. And the scarcity of the resources is basically what drives the entire economy, the entire field of economics. And this is, again, how we have to consider the city. Why we're looking at the city? Because in the city we have some scarce resources, and those resources have been divided very wisely between different users, different people and groups. Also, why we have to make a choice all the time? Because sometimes once we are thinking about the production, we're always thinking about how to increase the scale of the production, how to make from very, very small to something very big. Because once we produce more, the cost per unit is going down. And this decreasing in the per unit cost is what drives the entire economic activity in most cities, and this is what drives economic activity on the large scale. So once we're thinking about the city, we have to understand what is the role of the scale effects in the economics of the cities. And also we are talking about substitution. Again, we have to understand who is going to receive what, in which term, and how to substitute between different resources. Do we have too many people in the firm? Do we have too many people in the city? Can we replace some of the people with the mechanism, with machines? If we have too much land, can we use this somehow? For example, have you ever heard about endowed universities? The endowed university in many American and European places is the university which was given some endowment, which is usually some fund or usually some asset, some piece of capital. Very often this piece of capital could be some amount of land. So for example, the University of Chicago was given a certain size of land, and they could not use this land for the agricultural use, but they could use this land for raising money. They basically rented out this land to different people, and from the profits from this land, they financed the activity of the university. So again, we are talking about how to substitute some resources for some other resources, and this is what we are going to do within economics. Once we are talking about urban economics, we have one more important question to answer. What do you think this question is?
It's written there. What is urban?
No. What is urban is the kind of a title, but the question is which additional question, in addition to what to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce, we are going to answer within the urban setting. Where? Exactly. We are talking about where. Bingo. So basically, once we are talking about distribution of activity, we are talking about distribution of activity between different users and also between different spaces, between different places, which adds another dimension to the problem and which actually makes the problem even harder to understand what is going on. So, and we basically start with what Kobler said, the first law of geography. He said that everything is connected to anything, which is kind of obvious, but close things are connected much stronger. And this is what drives the entire behavior of people in the city, why people get connected, why people actually flow into the cities. Because in the cities, the distance between people is lower, and that is why people will have stronger connection and stronger economies of those. So choices. We are looking at what, how, and for whom, and also we are looking at the city as the unifying source for all those choices altogether. So we are looking at the city as an economist, as some structure which connects all those choices of all different people all together and puts all those choices into the spatial context. Into the spatial means it puts them into the place and tries to understand how people interact within this space. What is a city? Which is kind of an interesting question. I would like you to give me some definitions of what the city is. How do you define a city?
Has the population up to 12,000 people?
Okay, we're talking about something like population about 12,000 people. What else?
Infrastructure.
When you know specific, what kind of infrastructure which defines specifically a city? What kind of infrastructure makes a city a city? Transport? Public transit probably would be more better choice.
Public services.
United administration, united budget.
So we basically we have some of the definitions of what the city is. Let's look at how different people define what the city is. What makes a city a city? The Guardian newspaper. I think I have to write it down. They actually said that in the US Midwest, admittedly the word city has been appended with abandon to any one brother main street that once offered to live to travelers across the ferries. Do you know what the brother is? Yes, no?
What is it?
So basically they define the city from the point of view of the entertainment somewhere in the middle of the prairies in the United States. Once we're looking at the definition in France, I was talking to economic geographers in France and they said the city boundary is defined in a very interesting way. The distance between two buildings at the end of the city should not exceed 200 meters. If we put another building on this border, that means the city borders kind of expand. So they try to define the city as some settlement within certain borders. If you're looking at the standard definition, this is kind of large and permanent human settlement. Again, some large and permanent where people live in big mass. In the former USSR, for example, the city was a large settlement where residents were not engaged in agricultural production. again, this was a very scientific and very rigorous definition. The city is something where people do not do any agriculture. And also, the borders of the city in the former Soviet Union was defined by the general plan. What is interesting, in one of my studies I needed to have to calculate the area of each city in Ukraine, of each large city in Ukraine. I found out that those general plans do not exist for some of the cities. So according to this definition, we do not have general plans for approximately more than a half of big cities in Ukraine. That means we do not have any strict borders defined, because the general plan kind of it means that those cities should be that those borders should be in place, but they are not. So again, we are thinking about what the city is, where the city ends, and as a result, for example, I was looking at the official data at the site of Verkhovna Rada, and they had areas of each city in Ukraine. And there were some very strange situations. For example, do you know what is the approximate area of the city of Kyiv? Approximately 250 areas, something like that. Thousands of square kilometers, something like that. If you look at the city of Sevastopol, which is actually much smaller, the official area of the city of Sevastopol is approximately the same as the city of Kyiv, because the city of Sevastopol includes all other areas around it. On the other hand, for example, if you're looking at the city of Yuzhny, the city of Yuzhny is only one half of the square kilometers, which is officially on the site of Verkhovna Rada, again, due to the length of those general plans. So once we are thinking about the cities, we have to create some kind of new methodology of how to define what the city is. Extreme examples. We can look at the city of Shanghai. The population of Shanghai right now is a bit less than 25 million people. And all of these people live in just in one city. On the other hand, we have very small city of Uvniv. I think this is the smallest city in Ukraine. As of several years ago, their population was highly above 1,000 people. The area was something like 2 square kilometers. And still, this settlement had the status of the city due to some budgetary reasons, for whatever reasons they are. So we have the whole range of different cities, starting from megapolises, which include several European countries in them, up to the very small cities, which actually could be called villages, but this is pretty much 2 high buildings in this city, that is why they probably call it a city. And also, if you follow some of the news, the area around Shanghai is going to be created into one big agglomeration area. So they're going to unite all of the settlements all together into one mega city with a population of more than 200 million people out there.
And they want to divide it into different areas, and each area has to deal with some different kind of things. For example, one area is going to be in IT, another area is going to produce something.
But still, we're talking about some kind of administrative borders. We're talking about something which is managed as one thing. So and this is kind of interesting. What different people believe what the city is. So what is the city? Historically, this was the place where we had the unity of many different crafts. So we're talking about craftsmen, those people who did something with their hands. We're talking about the center of trade. This means where those whatever was produced was exchanged in places and hands. We're talking about administrative role, and this is somebody of you has mentioned this administration is an important part of the city. So this is something which comes from a very long time ago. We are talking about military and armory. So because the ancient city has been always the center of the military defense of the country or of some particular group of people. The city is very much defined by the architecture, something which is translated in Russian as zodchestvo. So because I think this zodchestvo is a better term here, and we are talking about architecture as the peculiar form of the city. And once we are thinking about the city, we always think about the architectural style of that. We are talking about the literacy levels, which have usually been much higher than the rural areas. We are talking about a certain amount of the luxury in the city. This is what attracts people over there to the city. And also, we are talking about some personal walled houses, something that doesn't exist in the rural areas. And if you think about modern city right now, the definition of the city doesn't change much compared to this one. So, how have cities started? One of the theories was that cities have started from the villages up. So first there was some kind of settlement. The settlement was very small. Out of the settlement, there was some walls around the settlement, and then the city appeared. Actually, if you look at the history of absolute majority of the cities in the human civilization, even the word civilization comes from the word civil, which actually means a city. So basically the entire absolute majority of the cities started from scratch as the cities, with the role as the cities. It is very rare that you can find a village that actually became a city simply because the city and the village had completely different economic and administrative roles. There is a beautiful book by Jane Jacobs, which is called The Economy of the Cities, which was written in 1969, and she actually tracks the history of the cities back to the cities of Urartu, which is thousands of years ago, and she is very compellingly shows that almost no city was built on the developed from the village itself. Absolute majority of the cities started as cities from the very beginning. Because once we are thinking about the village, we are thinking about small settlement, which is mostly agriculture. Once we are thinking about the city, we are thinking about the settlement, which is non-agriculture. And this is the major difference which made them to grow up. What's the scarcest resource in the city? Space. There is another one, which is actually also very much required, but at this moment we are talking about space. So once we are talking about the space actually determines how the city looks like. This is the city of Hong Kong. And you can see that since the city is extremely limited in the territory, the city has to grow up. And one of the questions that we have to decide among ourselves as citizens of many cities, do we have to grow up or do we have to sprawl around the entire territory? This is the city of Kyiv. This is actually President of Kyiv. You can see that again, even though the territory of Kyiv is quite large, still the city looks very much like Hong Kong in some particular patterns, because again, the city is going up. And once we are talking about the city which is going up, this is usually due to some particular relationship between the price of land, between the price of labor, and between productivity of people who live out there. So once we see that the city is going up, most of the times it means the city is going to develop in what is called the modern way. Because if you're looking at the tendency of most cities in the world, absolute majority of the cities are going to grow up. And this is what we have to admit as something which is kind of inevitable. So how do we measure this density? How do we measure the density of the people in the city? It's kind of the number of people per square kilometer. The question is how to measure square kilometers. The gross density, which includes all the land, so if you look at the map of Kyiv, you will see that absolute majority of land in Kyiv is not populated at all. The net density includes only land that is residential use. In that case, for example, Kyiv, Moscow, St. Petersburg would be probably among the highest populated areas in Europe. Why do we need density? And this is something which probably approaches us to the most important ideas of this lecture. Because once we have density, this is immediately the space where people share ideas, methods, where people share their thoughts. And we have to look at the city as the place where people share those ideas, and those ideas let the city grow further. As a result, once we're talking about sharing the ideas, it immediately comes to creating some synergies between industries and also synergies between professions. If you're thinking about what is the most cherished right now in the world on the job market, if you're thinking about what kind of future professions are going to be in the most demand, in the most demand we are going to see people who have multiple specialities which are not very much connected with each other. And this only can be obtained in some cities and nowhere else. Because once we are talking about not unconnected, we are talking about, for example, architects and economists. Or we can talk about financial analysts and the artists. Or we can talk about people who are engaged simultaneously in biotechnologies and probably in computer science. Only when we have those synergies between different professions, something new and something interesting can emerge. So once we are talking about that, and this can only be achieved once we are talking about densities and in some places where people are densely located to each other. And there are hundreds of economic studies which show the effect of density on economic growth and the effect of density on the creation of new ideas. So once you complain that your city is overpopulated, first, it is probably not, and second, it is probably not enough. Once we are thinking about the size of the city, and once we are thinking about the size of the city of Kyiv, for example, Kyiv is much smaller than it potentially could be and than it potentially should be. Because the density of population of Kyiv is not sufficient to produce that many ideas that Kyiv is capable of. Also, once we are talking about density, in density we have what Schumpeter called creative destruction. Have you heard this term before? What does it mean, creative destruction?
Oxymoron.
No, this is not oxymoron. This is the term which was coined by Joseph Schumpeter in the 30s. Creative destruction means that once we have some activity and this activity becomes obsolete, once this activity becomes not needed on the market, this activity is replaced by some other activity. So we create new activity, and the new activity replaces the old one, destroys the old one. So for example, if we're thinking about shipbuilding in the 19th and the 18th century, there were several cities, for example, the city of Bristol in England, which actually came as the city which produced lots of ships and lots of takelage for the ships. Those industries were completely replaced, for example, by the steam production, and the steam production was completely replaced by the automobile industry. This is what creative destruction is. So once we are talking about cities, we are talking about this increasing density, and this density which actually creates innovation. The density creates new ideas which are based on the previous old ideas. Then once we are talking about the trade, city provides much broader market. Because we do not, this is kind of illusion that we do all the trade just picking up the phone and writing the emails. Most of the trade is done on the face-to-face coordination, on the face-to-face cooperation. So once we would like to produce some service, once we would like to produce some good, most of all we have to meet those people in the market and would like to sell this good to them directly, face-to-face. This is basically why we see the increased number of air travel around the world, despite all the internet. Because lots of people would like to travel across oceans just to make this trade happen. And obviously, this all happens due to the shorter distances that we have. Density is extremely uneven between countries. This is the map of which is made from the satellite, and it shows where the majority of the human civilization actually is. We see that this is the east of the United States, the west of Europe, a bit of India, a bit of China, east of China. The rest of the territory of the Earth is basically depopulated. If you compare the map of Ukraine, which was made in 1980, the end of 80s, to the map which is made right now, you can see that we have drastic decrease of the number of those night lights compared to those 80s, to the end of the Soviet Union times. So basically it means that economic activity on this terrain is going down. And there are on the several spots where the economic activity has been preserved or increasing. This is basically Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the city of Belgrade to the east of Kharkiv. Once we're talking about density, density is very uneven between countries. This is data from 2013. I guess this area would be depopulated by now, but still we have very uneven distribution of density within countries. If we look at the countries from a different perspective, we still see that the density is very uneven within countries as well. So you can see that the eastern part of the United States is mostly populated. There are some people who populated on the west, and the majority of the territory of the United States is basically depopulated. If you look at the very similar map, even within cities, you can see very similar picture. So that in every city there are some territories which are extremely populated, some territories which are mostly depopulated. And Kyiv is basically over here as well. Again, people get together. but people get together not in even particles. People get together in some places. There are people collect disproportionately to greater extent. In some territories, people don't go at all. So, what kept places sparse over centuries, and how cities actually went into existence? I'm talking mostly right now about the last 100, maybe 150 years. Because previously the history of the human civilization was more or less the same across centuries. There were several cities. Majority of those cities were not particularly high. A lot of people lived in the urban areas, and urbanization is the phenomenon. It's basically the phenomenon of the 20th century. Once we are thinking about the urbanization level right now, over the world is about 60%. In the developed world, it's about 70%. In Ukraine, it's also between 60 and 70%. So once we are looking at this, the density of the population across cities and places, we can see that there were some places where people lived in the very, very densely, and there were lots of places where people didn't live at all. So this is the transition of the map of Europe, which shows how the density of the population proceeded over time. This is approximately the year 1000, this is approximately the year 1500. So you can see that some countries were traditionally overpopulated, some countries were kind of sparse, but again, the density was developing very, very slowly. The densiest part over here would calculate for something like 42 people per square kilometer, which is extremely low by all modern standards. So, what kept places very sparse over centuries? First, it was distances between cities, and the lack of roads, and the lack of proper roads, and the lack of transportation between them. Second, there were certain fortification limits. Once we were talking about people who lived within the city walls, and the city walls could protect only a certain number of people, and unfortunately not more. So even if you look at the city of Kyiv, was increasing over centuries, since the city of Vladimir to the city of Yaroslav and further on, but still the area of the fortified Kyiv was very, very small. You can actually walk around across it within 10 to 15 minutes. Another thing is sanitary and health. And this is something which is very important, because the morbidity of people, the level at which people die, was much higher before cities came to existence. Building technologies and agricultural productivity. Agricultural productivity is probably one of the most important from the economic point of view, because increasing the agricultural productivity led people to substitute their effort to something which is produced in the city. And also, lack of free movement of people, which is protection of the basic rights, which is also no less important than anything else. Once we're looking at transportation, first would be the railways. The railways was just tremendous increase in the speed and the volume of how many goods could be hauled over high distances. In Europe, the first commercial railways were created in the beginning of the 19th century. In the US, it was a little bit later. In the United States, they actually started with the system of the canals between cities and between different lakes. And you could see a very nice, interesting historical document, which is the letter from the owners of those canals to the administration. And the subject of this letter was, we have to put all the railroads out of operations because they are very dangerous. They go at very high speeds of something like 20 miles per hour, which is faster than any horse, and so forth. So this was the first system of the public transportation, which ultimately failed due to the development of the railroads in the United States, and also the railroads actually overcame international shipments as well. The second one was the national defense system. Once nation states more or less defined the borders, and once the place was more or less split equally between different nations, national defense system started, and the end of the First World War actually made people think in a completely different mindset. so that we can ultimately destroy the world that we are living in. And this is actually what created, what led to freeing people from the defense, from the own defense, and giving this defense business over to the state and over to the government. The next one would probably be the sewage. This was the sewage in the ancient Rome. The system of the sewage was very well known back then, but unfortunately it was only available for the richest families and for the richest households. As a result, the lack of the sewage created huge health problems across Europe, basically until the end of the 19th century. And only when the central sewage system were constructed all over the cities became a safer place to live. On this picture, you can see the construction of the sewage collector in the city of Lodz in the end of 20th, beginning of 30th of the last century. Then we are talking about the healthcare, which has also created huge incentives for people to live in one place and not kill each other with different diseases. In the 80s, the Thames and actually the London was pretty stinky place to live, because Thames was actually called filthy Father Thames because lots of sewage was put back into the Thames River. On the other hand, this was about the time when the vaccination started. And despite all the wars about the vaccination that we see right now in the society, vaccination has produced tremendous boost in the health of the population and in the decreasing the number of the children in the families, and at the same time, the longevity of the people, the time how long the people live. We can also talk about building technology. Two important building technologies were created in America in the 20s. The first one, Otis elevator. Elevator was actually, the elevator as the machine was invented yet by whom? Yes? Who invented the elevator? I would expect answers between Leonardo da Vinci and Archimedes. And this was pretty much there. So the first idea of elevator were actually developed yet in ancient Greece. However, the first elevators were kind of dangerous thing. So you have to put into the cage, you have to get into the cage. This cage was put up by different machines, which was pretty dangerous thing. And Otis created the security brake on the elevator. This is the picture from his demonstration. So he put himself up onto the top of the tower. Then he asked his associates basically to cut the rope. And everybody said, oh! And he was going down, and then he stopped in the middle because his security brakes actually worked. So he had shown this, and this security brakes made elevator a public product, because before that, elevators were only available in some houses of very rich people. Another thing, the first skyscrapers. This is probably one of the first skyscrapers in history. This is some Union Trust building in Chicago. It was built at the end of 19th century. And actually this entire technology of building up, of creating buildings which were higher than 9 stories, created the modern city in the way that we see it right now. So both elevators and construction of the high buildings made it possible for the cities to grow up, to grow into to grow to the skies. The next thing, once we're talking about this, we're talking about the human rights and about the workers' rights. So previously, the morbidity among children was very high because the child labor was very much an operation. Once we are thinking right now about very nice and prosperous and prospective and socialist Sweden, we probably don't know what the Sweden got this prosperous state from. Time ago, I was in the city of Jönköping, and this is believed to be the city where the usual Swedish match was created. You know what the Swedish match is, right? Usual Swedish match. And there was a very nice museum which actually has shown how this entire thing was created. And the inventor of the Swedish match was a very harsh man. He had a family of something like 7 or 10 children, and he made all of his children work on his factory. Also, he made his wife work on his factory, and the technology of producing those matches was so that matches were put into something which was called phosphorus, and those phosphorus evaporations were extremely dangerous for health. So a person who was working with this phosphorus could live for something like 10-20 years only. So basically his wife died because she was doing all those matches for him before he invented the machine which was doing all that. And previously all the matches using child labor in huge quantities, and this was extremely dangerous for many people. So sometimes people didn't want to go to the cities because it was quite dangerous for their health as well. And it was very dangerous to stay in those cities. And the same is about goes about the right of women to work, because all the female movements, all those emancipation movements, actually led to the situation where the salaries of women, they're still lower than the salaries of men, but they're not so much drastically lower than they used to be 100 years ago. So right now we are talking about the gender differentials and wages of something like 10-15%. Back then we were talking about something like 200-300% for the very same job, for the same level of qualification. This kind of equality, this also brought people up to the cities so that lots of people could do the jobs which could only be available to men before that. And finally, the mass market. The mass markets, these were the marketplaces which were created also in the city by the people who lived in the city. And this was a huge boost in the trade. So people didn't have to produce their own goods for their own production, they could buy this in the supermarket. Do you know what was the major invention, or why the supermarket was a great invention?
Gathered all together, all the products.
Usual village fair was also brought them all together. Baskets on wheels, it was kind of minor invention that was invented later on. Cars is also later on. I'm talking about the first supermarket. This supermarket was opened in 1920, something like that. This is like Tesco and all of this. But this was the period of between 1910 and 1920 was the boost of new supermarkets. Previously, all the markets were bought and sold on the open markets. And usually, women were doing this daily job of going to the supermarkets, and they can actually bargain over prices. And it so happens that this bargaining could not be done by children and by men, because men who was usually working on other occupations, they didn't know what price was fair, they didn't know how to bargain properly. And also it was kind of dangerous to put children to the bargaining, because children were very easily lied to, so people could cheat on children as well. The idea of the supermarket was the idea of the standard prices for all goods which are sold there. So everybody who entered the supermarket was guaranteed to have the same price. And this immensely helped women to send their husbands and their children to the supermarket, because the supermarkets could not cheat on their relatives, unlike the open marketplaces. So this creation of the supermarkets actually created equal rights for all different shoppers for all different states. So yes, you're right, the card on the wheels and the credit cards, which was further innovations which were no less important. But the first important was the equality of the prices, was creating of some marketplace where all those markets could be created. So we are talking about lots of those key advances, and all of them put together created the place for the market. And finally, the agriculture. This picture could be done anywhere over hundreds of years or thousands of years. And this was the boost of the Industrial Revolution actually brought the boost in the agricultural productivity and agricultural production phase. So what attracts people to cities? First, this would be social lifts. This is something like diversity, this is something like opportunities, this is something that people would like to realize themselves. This is also, as I said, the attractiveness for women and the female rights. But also, which is no less important, this would be entertainment and food. There are lots of stories where, if you are thinking about all big-scale entertainment, be it the art gallery or some kind of the rock concert, or maybe something like the opera standard or classical music, or if you're thinking about some restaurants, some like usual French cuisine, or maybe Indian cuisine, or Chinese cuisine, you can find this place only mostly in cities. You cannot find very good restaurants in some village most of the time because the market would be large. And actually, the very first restaurant, you know how what the word restaurant means? It was created by one French chef in the end of the 18th century, and actually he started to produce soups for his customers. And he said, the word restaurant actually comes from the word restore in French, which basically means to restore your health. So the restaurant is the place where you can restore your health and your good spirits, and we do this with the help of the soup. So this was how the word was created, and this is actually how people started gathering together and eating out. Because before that, once we're thinking about the usual city, you can see that the city is pretty small. That means the apartments are usually very small, and restaurants provided lots of opportunity to eat out, at least sometimes. At least not always, but at least sometimes. So this is something that attracts people to the cities no less than this plethora of different opportunities. What else? Why cities can prosper and why cities can fail? It is possible to see lots of different stories where some cities were prospering in some periods of time and actually falling down later on. This is the city of Hiroshima in 1945, and the same is the city of Detroit in the same year. 60 years later, they look completely different. Hiroshima was kind of restored to the normal modern city, not without some problems, but still. Whereas Detroit was basically has lost about 2/3 of the population, and part of the city was turned into basically slums. Once we are thinking about cities, can cities reinvest themselves? This was the city of New York, very nice, very vibrant city with lots of producing, with lots of people who are doing lots of business, and this city which was growing up very fast. But if you look at New York in the 80s, this is not exactly New York, this is South Bronx, which is a part of New York. And you can see that again, it was pretty much depopulated, it was a pretty dangerous place to live. This was metro in the 80s in New York, and this is pretty much metro in New York right now. So again, at some moment of time, New York became a place which was a very dangerous place to live, which was not very much attractive, where the property prices went down. The question is why, and the question is what we can do about that. This is how New York looks approximately right now. So the last time I checked, it was pretty much the same. So I mean, again, it kind of reinvented itself. So the question is how cities can reinvent themselves and how cities can make prosper further on. The question is also, can we build a city from the scratch? Can we build a city just in the middle of the desert? The answer is, if you have enough money, probably you can. If you look at the Dubai in 1991, this was pretty much the desert, nothing more. This is the same place in Dubai just 20 years later on. So with a certain amount of money, the place can be rebuilt. But money is not all that we need for rebuilding the city. This is also the story of Dresden. During the war, the Dresden was almost completely destroyed. And the total number of people who died in this bombing in Dresden was compared to the number of people who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But also, Dresden was reinvented itself, and lots of money was put to rebuild Dresden as the new city. But why do cities fail? Why actually cities kind of close down? Why we see declining in the population and the economy of the cities? Lots of problems exist. First of all, what is called negative externalities. We are talking about congestion. We are talking about pollution. This is some place. I think this was around Los Angeles. So this is like a permanent traffic jam. I don't know if you follow the news. Recently, there was a huge traffic jam somewhere in China on some big highway with something like 25 lanes in one direction. So this is one of the ideas which suggests that the city is probably a little bit overpopulated at the moment. It's also kind of pollution, which is no less important, but also lack of diversification, and this is probably the most important. This is what stands behind the failure of Detroit. Detroit was the city which produced lots of cars, which had 5 or 6 major car producers in the world, and they put everything on car production. And once car became out of fashion because they were not very much economical compared to Japanese counterparts, they were kind of very much leading the economic cycle. The Detroit lost of its appeal because the car was pretty much the only thing that Detroit produced. If we are thinking about the economic reasons for the war in Donbass right now, those reasons are very much similar. Just recently, a couple of days ago, there was an article in the Journal of Comparative Economics where the author actually has shown that the separatist movements were especially strong in the places where the cities and those small settlements were first not diversified and second very much directed towards the trade with Russia. The economic reasons which actually put people into the fear that they are going to lose anything if Ukraine joins Europe, and this was why one of the reasons why people supported separatist movement. They actually made it worse, and they could have made it worse, and this could also be predicted because those places were severely under-diversified. Once we are talking about diversification is probably the key for any place to prosper. So if we compare Detroit and New York, Detroit put everything onto the car production, New York put lots of things on financial sector, on services sector, on entertainment sector, on food, and that is why that small business in New York actually pulled the city out, whereas all those big businesses in Detroit could not do anything because the city was over-monopolized by one industry. Another thing, too little public space. Once we are looking at the plan, how the cities are designed right now, we can see that we build very high buildings with very little public space around them. Public space is basically the first floors. If you look at this city over here, what it is? Barcelona. No. So if you look over here, you can see that there are lots of public space because of those quarters. On those quarters, the entire first building of the quarter is something. This could be stores, this could be some cafes, this could be some chiller gutters, this could be something where people meet on an everyday basis. If you have the buildings like that, people simply do not have much time to live. Because this is just the picture from one of the developer sites, but what is going to be between those buildings is basically a parking lot. So what we see people who are very much isolated from each other. So we have some density, but this density doesn't work. So once we are talking about cities, once we are talking about recipes, why city prosper? First, very important, once we are talking about city is not buildings. City is not very much infrastructure. City is mostly about people. So once we are thinking about the city, we have to invest first of all in the human capital. Human capital in terms of education, wealth, crime, ecology, something which makes people to develop. So once we are thinking about proper urban planning, the person is somebody who should be put into the place. Not preserving the historical heritage, not investing into the public infrastructure, not investing into the transportation, investing in people and trying to understand what makes those people to be happy in this city. And happiness is kind of economic category in this sense as well. So infrastructure is no less important. Roads, utilities are important to sustain a certain level of happiness among the people. And the same is about innovation. Once we do not have any innovations, and we're not going to have innovations without education, we're not going to have any city to prosper. I think we can stop right now because I guess this is kind of the end of the time already, and we probably can get a couple of questions from you if you want.
Yeah. First of all, I would really like to thank you for such a good lecture. Thank you. Then we have some organization moments. You have a gift from us. Yeah, so here you are. Yeah, first of all. And yeah, we have a round of questions. I would really like you to ask them in English, because lecture was in English, obviously. So please raise your hands if you have any. Come on, don't be so afraid. It's okay.
Yeah, so you need to work in to ask something.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about Donbass region. Yeah, so we have a problem. The war is going in Donbass, and personally, I agree with you that the cities which are started in Donbass, they're actually not very effective to the 21st century. And my question is, is it a good idea really to renovate these cities, which were produced according to the needs of the beginning of 20th century and according to links with Russia? Or maybe we should help the people to go somewhere else or to reconstruct the region in some other terms.
Economics is a very mean science. It means we cannot tell people what to do. We can describe them their choices, and we can make those people, we can let them people to decide what they want to do. We can develop a plan, how to reconstruct the Donbass area, and how to introduce more investment to the place, how to introduce more education into the place. But this is, after all, the local decision, the decision of people who live up there, just to understand what they actually want more. Whether they want to leave Donbass and to live in some other areas, or whether they want to stay there and develop because this is their own region. Right now what I see that lots of people with high skills actually left Donbass, so I actually don't know how many people, how much human capital is left there to redevelop this area from the scratch. However, if we are talking not about tomorrow, if we are talking about the perspective of 20 to 50 years, I think it is kind of possible that a new generation might come, and that still it is possible to rejuvenate that area to some extent. Maybe to the same extent as it used to be, because we have to understand that the prosperity of Donbass was basically based on the industries which are becoming more and more obsolete right now. So if there are going to be local decision of people who live there with the help of probably international people and intellectual community to reinvent this place with more education and more investment, this is something may happen out of that on the long term. But I don't see any easy solution over the short term while the war lasts over there.
So, any other questions? Oh.
Okay, the first, just a small one, and I would like to connect to it. The first question is, do you make a difference between the town and the city? And so, the second question is, which is connected, does this recipe work for like both towns and cities? Because Ukraine have lots of cities which people commute, like Shoska, who work there, they live elsewhere, which is not like cities, those towns are not Shoska itself, because the city is specialized in some production. And so, connected to that, do you support the view on those mega cities which like are being united, like in Shanghai? So what is the limit of population? You know, how much the city can actually expand?
From the economic point of view, we are talking about the economy of scale. That means the larger the city is, the more productive it is. That means it might be more economically viable, it might be more economically desirable to have one huge mega city with approximately 1/3 of the population of the country living in that, distributing its resources to the rest of the country. This is some kind of ideal economic landscape which is probably not supported by the majority of people over here. Because majority of the people would like to live where they were born, they have some ties, they have some connections, and majority of the people actually not very much mobile. So once I'm talking about cities, I'm talking about some kind of urban settlement. I don't have any distinction between large city and small cities because now we're talking about some scale. Obviously we're talking about some hierarchy of cities. So there are some big cities which produce lots of stuff, there are some smaller cities which produce some of the stuff, and there are even smaller cities which produce only one or two major products, as Shoska actually producing all the gunpowder and maybe some chemistry, right? So once we're talking about that, still, the recipe of human capital, education, and innovation is universal for any development city. If you look at the story of the success of many cities around the world, you can see that cities succeeded only when they allowed more education, when they allowed more free business, when they allowed more free entrepreneurship, and this entrepreneurship somehow got the problem solved. If you try to invest directly from the state level to some particular city, in the majority of the cases this is not going to work. Because once we are thinking about supporting somebody specifically, this is usually going about monopolization of the place, and this is usually not the most economically viable in the long term. So it can revive the city, but on the other hand, it can do whatever the support of our outside industry has done in Ukraine. So for the last 20 years, outside industry has been supported by the state, and we still do not have any outside industry yet. So this artificial support by the government doesn't seem to work in the majority of the cases. It might work somewhere, but there is no very strong economic evidence that it actually has. So that means, again, this is a very local decision. If the city wants to revive, the city should attract as many brains as possible. We are talking about the economy, which is the economy of the brains, not the economy of the things. So once we would like to produce something, we have to produce something which has very large margin, very large added value. And this is not right now something which, this is mostly ideas. This is not mostly some tangible production. All the tangible production can be outsourced to China, to Vietnam, to somewhere else. Over here we still have brains, and those brains can produce things which are worth much more. If we are thinking about the cost of the iPhone, actually the entire profit of the iPhone goes to Apple and the United States. Whereas in China, Apple is like 1, 2, 3% of whatever the iPhone will cost, even though they produce pretty much all the iPhones in the world. So once we are thinking about the revitalization of the cities, we are thinking about revitalization of the brains and putting some mental effort into designing those places. It doesn't matter much whether it's a big city or small city. This is pretty much a part of my course in Kyiv School of Economics, and we have 2 programs, one in business economics, one in economic analysis. If you would like to know more about this, probably entering our school on the master level would be a pretty good idea. Again, we help to develop brains there.
Yeah.
What do you think about cities like Las Vegas and Nevada, really entertaining cities for young women just having fun? Do you think that something like that would work out in Ukraine or happen?
It might be, because if you're thinking about Las Vegas is a place where they don't pay too much taxes, and they just attract lots of entertainment to one place. I have shown that entertainment is one of the driving forces for the city. So if we build a huge entertainment place in the middle of nowhere in Ukraine, it will, and if we do not try to get immediately lots of tax income from that place, we will be in better position to develop this entertainment industry, and this is going to help in the longer term to the economy of the country to a great extent. There were some ideas to open some kind of entertainment zone in somewhere in Crimea. I don't remember what is Simferopol, Sevastopol, somewhere else like that. I don't think this is a good idea because this, the entire peninsula is under occupation. If you can do this somewhere in Tver, or maybe around Dnipropetrovsk, or even somewhere not very far from Kiev, I think this would be a good idea. You know, we have lots of people who would be young entrepreneurs who can invest their money over there and build all those casinos. So casino is not something which is unique. We still have lots of casinos around. The proper regulation of that is something that can help.
Yeah, we still have one more question. Will be our last one, so please.
What do you think? Will we have in our future only big cities without villages and small cities? Because we can see that all of young people, they come to big cities and to have their life there. But in the small cities and in the villages, they stay only old people, and they are dying, and the villages and the small cities are dying too.
First, the question is how big is big and how small is small. I started my teaching career at the University of Kentucky, where I taught for the undergraduates, and I was teaching the classes of 60, 70 people, and I usually asked students what was the farthest place on earth they actually visited. Lexington, Kentucky is a pretty small metropolitan area with something like 300,000 people. The next big city nearby is Cincinnati, which is about 1 hour from Lexington, and they have something like about less than 2 million people. And several people literally said the largest city on earth that has ever been is Cincinnati, and this is pretty much the farthest point. If you see the total number of people with what is called foreign passports in Ukraine, how many do you think we have? Out of the entire population of Ukraine, percentage points. 10, 11 at most. That means only about 10% of the population has ever traveled somewhere around Ukraine. That means people are extremely immovable. So if all of your friends visited at least one foreign country, that basically means that you have a skewed sample. Absolute majority of people in Ukraine never travel anywhere, and approximately half of people in Ukraine die within 100 kilometers from the place where they were born. With this set of mind, I think the small cities are still going to survive for generations and generations, because people are not very mobile yet. So one of the ideas is to open the world to the people and to help people travel as much as possible, including the nearby cities and including travel within countries, not only abroad. Because the internal tourism, developing the internal tourism, developing conditions for the internal tourism is now as important for the development of the country as a whole and for developing separate regions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That actually we have one more gift for a person who by whom he was asked. So you have to choose a person who has the best question in your opinion, and we will give this gift, obviously, to this person.
I like the question also.
Okay, wonderful. You can collect your gift right now after it depends. Now we have a coffee break. Тобто зараз у нас кава брейк. Дякуємо ще за лекцію, що ви прийшли. Дякуємо Київській школі економіки. Так, і маленьке повідомлення, і ми йдемо на божественний клас.
Власне, хотів нагадати про розіграш нашого курсу. Всіх охочих ще заповнити картки, будь ласка, можете зробити протягом перерви і в нашу вазочку скинути ці карточки. Після перерви ми розіграємо і, власне, оголошуємо переможця. Дякую.